There's a new game in town. It's called putting the fun back into driving. Introducing the Toyota MR2 sports car.
Back in 1985, Toyota introduced its first mid-engine two-seater sports car, the MR2. Although originally designed to be more economy car than sports car, the MR2, especially in its first two generations, would lean more towards performance.
The fun is back.
This led to it gaining a reputation for requiring excellent driving skills to counteract its tendency towards snap oversteer. However, by its third generation, it was rebranded as the MR2 Spyder and exclusively sold as a convertible with a less powerful engine, losing its performance edge and many potential buyers, leading to its end in the US by 2005. This is the story of the Toyota MR2. This is my old car.
Unfortunately, and the specialist magazines agree on this, it has a gawky face.
You can't mark it down just for its looks.
Yes, you can.
So if you read the title of this video, you may be wondering how a name as simple as MR2 could pose a problem anywhere. The fact that Toyota chose an alphanumeric name itself is not typical, as most Toyotas have actual names, like Camry or Corolla. They went against their norm with all the Scion brand models, the RAV4, and more recently their EVs, such as the BZ4X. Yes, that's a real car name. Despite Toyota being a Japanese company, the name MR2 was clearly thought of with the English language in mind, as MR2 stood for either mid-ship runabout two-seater or mid-engine rear-drive two-seater. Both have been used interchangeably. The MR2 was also sold in Europe. However, in France, it was renamed to just MR. This is because when the number 2 is spoken in French, added on to the end of MR, it sounds like merda. And if you speak French, you know what that means. In fact, if you look inside the front trunk of the 3rd Gen MR2, you'll see the letters MR stamped in it, without the 2, presumably just so that same part could work in France as well. But if you weren't in France, sometimes the MR2 was pronounced as Mr. 2, probably by some as an honest mistake, but the nickname stuck, and many still affectionately call it Mr. 2 today. Although the MR2 may have been Toyota's first, and so far only mid-engine car,
I asked for it, I got it, Toyota.
It was conceived at a time when some of the best-selling cars in Toyota's North American lineup were subcompact economy cars, like the Corolla.
I wanted an inexpensive quality car and great gas mileage. How about lunch?
No lunch either.
Dinner?
Busy.
Okay, how about later at my place?
You're married, Herb.
Although it was first conceived in 1976, when Toyota was gaining a strong foothold in the US market, thanks to the ongoing gas crisis. The idea was for a car that was enjoyable to drive as well as fuel efficient. By 1979, the fun-to-drive requirement led to placing the engine behind the driver and mounting it transversely for better weight distribution. The idea of a mid-engine car was from Akio Yoshida, originally from Toyota's testing department, who would later lead the project. Not only would this be Toyota's first mid-engine design, it would also be the first for any Japanese automaker. The first concept car was called the SAX in 1981 and evolved into the SV3 by 1983. The SV3, as well as the MR2, had styling that fit perfectly into the boxy and sharp angled design style of the early 1980s. Many believe that the MR2 was an abandoned Lotus design, namely their X100 concept, since Toyota had a close cooperation with Lotus during that time, and Lotus had more experience than Toyota with two-seater sports cars. However, considering the X100 had its engine in the front, I'm not sure how that theory came to be. When the MR2 was in development, there was already a small mid-engine car on the market, the X19.
Clarkson! Where's my roof?
Originally designed and sold as a Fiat, but by 1983, with Fiat failing in the US market, it was being sold by Bertone. The X19 sales had been falling so much by the time the MR2 hit the US market in 1984.
Why have you driven over your own roof?
It's unlikely Toyota was all too concerned with the X19 as a serious competitor. However, Toyota was likely more concerned with a new entry from General Motors, the Pontiac Fiero, which launched just 6 months earlier than the MR2 in August of 1983 as a 1984 model.
Is that a Pontiac Fiero strapped to a rocket engine?
The Fiero would also be the first mid-engine car for General Motors, and I did an episode about it a couple years ago. In that episode, I got some pushback from a few viewers who considered the Fiero to be rear-engine, and therefore it wasn't GM's first, as that would be the Chevrolet Corvair from 1960. However, the Fiero, like the MR2 that soon followed it, was mid-engine, meaning that the majority of the engine sat between the axles. Whereas the Corvair and other rear-engine cars, like the Volkswagen Beetle and Porsche 911, have the majority of their engine behind the rear axle. A typical mid-engine car also has some trunk space between the engine and the rear bumper, although ironically, the third generation MR2 didn't have that feature. More on that later. The MR2 shared the Fiero's original intention to be a sporty but economical car. This ultimately hurt the Fiero, as Pontiac's marketing led consumers to believe that the Fiero was faster than it really was.
Want to see something really exciting?
From a displacement perspective, the Fiero's Iron Duke 4-cylinder engine was a 2.5 liter, whereas the first MR2s had either a 1.5 or 1.6 liter, known by MR2 fans as either the AW10 or AW11, with the latter being the most common. Despite the smaller displacement, the AW11's engine, which was also in the E80 series Corolla, had electronic fuel injection as opposed to the Iron Duke's 2-barrel carburetor, and made 112 horsepower for the US spec MR2, compared to just 90 horses for the Fiero. Like the Fiero, the MR2 could be had with either an automatic or manual transmission. However, the Toyota offered a 4-speed auto or 5-speed manual, which was an additional gear for both as compared to the Pontiac. The Fiero was a far better seller in its inaugural year, selling over 136,000 for the 1984 model, but that dropped to 76,000 for 1985. That's still far more than the 30,000 MR2 sales for 1985, but the MR2 quickly gained a reputation as focusing more on performance as compared to the Fiero. Toyota's commitment to performance was further established when they added a supercharger to the MR2 for the US market in 1988, but that may also have been to help reverse a drop in MR2 sales, which by that year was down below 10,000. Compare that to the Fiero, which sold about 26,000 in 1988, but that was also the Fiero's final year, as despite Pontiac's attempt to improve its performance with the addition of a V6 in 1985, its sales slide was too high to avoid the Fiero's cancellation. The addition of the supercharger to the MR2 brought its horsepower rating to just 5 more horses than the V6 Fiero, but the power boost didn't translate to a sales boost for either car, nor did accolades from Motor Trend or Car and Driver. The MR2 had a slight facelift in 1987, with changes in the bumpers and taillights and improvements on the interior, which led to their designations by MR2 fans as the Mark 1A and Mark 1B. Despite the updates, the car's overall styling was still very early 80s square. It also still offered T-tops, a feature that was introduced for the US and European markets in 1986, that used to be very common among sports cars in the 70s, but relatively rare by the end of the 80s. Yet despite this, Toyota still planned to keep the T-tops option for the upcoming second generation. By the end of the first generation, or Mark 1, around 96,000 MR2s were sold in the US and Canada combined. Although production of the second gen, or Mark II MR2, began in 1989, the US didn't see it until 1990 as a 1991 model. The MR2 second gen was a huge leap forward in style, with plenty of 90s style curves, and yet, despite composite headlamps becoming more common in the 90s, the MR2 kept its pop-up headlamps, which still look great on the curvier body, although I'm biased since I think pop-ups look cool on any car. Weighing over 350 pounds more than the first gen, the new MR2, now specified as the SW20, came standard with a naturally aspirated 4-cylinder that made 130 horses made into either a 4-speed auto or 5-speed manual, or a 2-liter turbo that made 200 horses, a lot of power for a car that was still under 3,000 pounds. The turbo was only made into the 5-speed manual, and by 1993 came standard with the T-tops. From the outside, only those with a keen eye could spot a turbo from a non-turbo on the street, as Toyota made very few visual differences between the two. Even the wheels and tires were staggered, with 225mm width out back, compared to only 195 in front, another nod to the MR2 being focused on performance. There was even a convertible offered as an aftermarket conversion, although very few of those were ever made. But all this new focus on performance also made the MR2 more difficult for novice drivers, who try to push it hard in the corners, thanks to what is known as snap oversteer. Oversteer is when a car tends to steer into a sharper turn than the driver intends, causing the rear end to swing out. But snap oversteer occurs when the rear end of the car abruptly swings or snaps in the other direction as the driver tries to correct it. The typical end result is the driver facing the wrong way. The MR2's mid-engine weight distribution, with less weight out front as compared to a front-engine car, means less weight was on the rear end if the driver let up on the throttle or brakes in a turn. Once the driver learns to manage the throttle properly in the turn, to get more downforce on the rear wheels, snap oversteer can be avoided. But this hasn't stopped the MR2 from being considered then, and still by some today, as the most dangerous car to drive on the track. Toyota made some changes to the suspension and tires to help prevent it.
But in this latest MR2, Toyota has raised mid-engine handling to new heights of security.
But ironically, this caused more dissatisfaction among the MR2's biggest fans, who learned to adjust to it and preferred the challenge. To those drivers, they felt that Toyota effectively neutered the car. Their term, not mine. Despite this, the MR2 was, in less extreme driving, a far better car to drive as compared to the first gen, thanks to a more comfortable interior and improved technology throughout. Its more attractive curvy exterior had many comparing it to a Ferrari, and in fact it was often called a baby Ferrari. Although US sales had bumped back to up to 15,000 for the start of the second gen, as compared to around 5,000 in the last year of the first gen, sales continued to slide for the US market, and despite the MR2 remaining in production for Japan until 1999, the Mark II generation ended US sales in 1995. With such poor sales by the end of the Mark II version of the MR2, it came as a big surprise, at least to me at the time, that a new MR2, the third generation, or Mark III, would be available for the 2000 model year. Known internally as the ZZW30, this last MR2 would be a significant redesign, now only offered as a convertible, and its full name now changed to MR2 Spyder. This new design was a foot shorter in length, and also could only be had with a 1.8-liter four-cylinder that just made 138 horsepower. No more supercharger like the Mark I, or a turbo like the Mark II. Although the first two generations were far from practical, they still had some trunk space behind the engine. However, the shorter length of the Mark III, plus the space needed to store the folded soft top with a glass rear window, left no room for any trunk space behind the engine. With very little space under the front hood either, the only remaining storage option for the third gen MR2 was a small compartment behind the seats, a whopping 2 cubic feet, accessible through 2 locking doors that oddly accessed the same space. And the top wasn't even powered, although it was light enough that you could raise and lower it from the driver's seat. On the outside, the familiar pop-up headlamps were replaced with not just composite lamps, but very large composite lamps.
Don't stare at me, you got the bug eyes.
Although maybe they just seemed really big on such a small car.
Sorry about the bug eyes thing, I'll be in my office.
The only transmission for the 2000 was a 5-speed manual. However, for 2001, they offered what they called a sequential manual transmission, which allowed shifting without a clutch. But this option was a significant performance hit, taking over 2 seconds longer for 0 to 60 miles per hour than the standard manual. Unlike the previous two generations, the Mark III wasn't nearly as popular, thanks to its mild performance and almost zero practicality, resulting in just 27,000 sold in the US between 2000 and 2005. Toyota continued production of the MR2 through 2007 in other markets, but it faded into obscurity in its final year here stateside. Finding an MR2 today from either the first or second generation that is still stock is a bit of a challenge, thanks to being popular for mods from the aftermarket tuning crowd. If you prefer a true sports car, a Mark I or II is still the way to go, but if you're a little older and just want a top-down cruiser, maybe the Mark III is more your style. But if you can wait a little longer and can afford it, there may be a new MR2 on the way, and it may still be offered with an internal combustion engine mounted behind the seats. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, click the like button and subscribe to my channel.
James May is, there's no other word for it, winning!
If you once owned a car from the 70s to mid-2000s that you rarely see today and would like it featured in a future episode, leave a reply in the comments or contact me at the email shown here. See you next time.